Good afternoon. I am Moretz from Apex-Brasil. My guests today are Professor Albert Keidel, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Daniel Poon, Economist at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Our conversation today is about One Belt, One Road initiative, also called as OBOR, or Belt Road Initiative, called as BRI. It was launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013, and in short, is a huge investment program that aims to modernize roads, ports, airports, pipelines, waste and water management facilities. It's a huge program from China to Europe. For many, it's the defining project of our century. So Daniel, please, what makes this project so unique?
Well, just to get into some of the numbers, at least, the project itself links together 60% of the world population. So that's 340 million out of Europe, 1.3 billion in China, and 2.7 billion for the rest of the other countries involved. In terms of GDP, it includes 40% of the world's GDP in this project, which is about 12% from Europe, China 70%, and others 11%. But beyond the numbers, I think what it represents is a new form of global cooperation that is perhaps not centered just around a multilateral organization with very strict rules and enforcement of the rules, but the one that is anchored in trade and investment. And if with infrastructure being the driving force behind the project, given the huge demand or the huge gap of infrastructure in the developing world, this is an opportunity for countries to not only receive the infrastructure itself, but also perhaps to draw some technology transfer, employment obviously, and greater economic activity that can come from better interconnectivity between these countries. And as China grows in the global stage, it wants to assert a certain amount of influence and leadership, essentially. And I think this is a way that they've managed to conceive how best to do that, given the general conditions of slow growth in the world, and the need for increasing demand. And I think that's a way to create that demand through the financing of infrastructure projects.
But this project is also raising concerns among some specialists, especially in the United States, about China's real intentions behind it.
Well, China has numerous intentions. I think it's a mix, and they're really quite understandable. The main need is for a very large throughput transport corridor to get to the European market. I mean, Europe is China's largest export market. There are some who talk about a chain of islands that might block China's seafaring commercial activity if there's some international crisis. To be able to go overland to Europe and to also reach other oceans overland and then have that connection is, I think, the major one. But, for example, China also has a very poor western region. Many of the beginning points for communications with Europe in this road or belt area are in China's west. China has certain terrorism concerns and its pan-Turkestan problems, that if it can develop that region further and become more of a positive dimension in both Western China and in the neighbors to its west, that also serves China's interests. There are issues, for example, with terrorism. They have a combination with Afghanistan and Pakistan and Tajikistan, which is, as far as they're concerned, quite an important part of trying to maintain control over terrorism. So I think in addition to commerce, there is a range of issues that really serve China's national security concerns.
So these projects are very complicated. They go in this area, and some critics say that China does not have experience in managing this kind of project. Other critics that I read about American scholars, some say that China's real motivations are projecting power and influence, not doing business. What's your opinion about it?
Well, in terms of their experience in doing infrastructure projects, I think they have a great deal of experience both domestically and internationally. Their domestic experience is one that involves government funds that then leverage other for-profit financial institutions, and you get a mix of funding. But they also have a way of managing the finance at the local level, so you have individual agencies or platform companies that are financially responsible and in an accounting sense independent. And that allows monitoring in a much clearer way, rather than giving the money to an agency that was a big construction company to do the task, or giving it to a fiscal bureau where the money disappears. So that this individual platform, financially accountable organization of individual projects is something that China's had a lot of success with since the 1990s domestically. And it also then has been doing infrastructure projects around the world as part of its efforts to open up different continents and provide, again, logistical or port support. And so I think that experience will serve them well. As for the discomfort, you could say, of other countries in China projecting power, it's clear that economic growth and expansion also brings with it the capability to support yourself. And now this move into Central Asia moves in the direction of one of the most conflicted areas of the world. But China has a sort of a neutral position there. It's not Sunni or Shia, it's not Palestine or Israel. It has complex relations there, and it brings with it a different practical approach, what will work. And perhaps that can be a contribution to the region, but it certainly complicates it. For example, its relationship with Iran as a source of oil has to raise eyebrows. There's no doubt about it.
Okay. So Daniel, please tell us more about the projects. Have them started already, or so far does it exist just in theory?
No, they've definitely started, but again, it's very much on a bilateral basis, given that the construct of the plan is as such. So I didn't really get into it in the initial part, but there's 6 corridors, aside from the inland belt, which goes from Western China through Central Asia, and then various ways to Europe, and then there's a maritime road that takes down through Southeast Asia, and then across Indian Ocean, and then up to Europe again. The inland part is made up of different corridors, right? So I wish I had a map to put that on, but there's 6 corridors, and I'll run through them quickly. There's a China-Mongolia-Russia economic corridor, what is called the New Eurasian Land Bridge corridor, and then there's China-Central Asia-West Asia corridor, China-Pakistan corridor, that's the only corridor that is really between 2 countries, and then the Bangladesh, China-India-Myanmar corridor, and finally the China-Indochina Peninsula economic corridor. So I think there's no master plan as such, but it really depends on the relations between the governments. So for example, in Southeast Asia, I know that they've been planning a rail link, a high-speed rail link. It's gone through several iterations because there's been problems, with political problems in essentially building the project. But I think now it's back on track. And so again, it really depends on the level of bilateral relations and how far those have progressed. Again, I just mentioned the China-Pakistan corridor, and that's an interesting one because obviously the relations between China and Pakistan are quite friendly and warm. And so it's already started certain projects such as a power generation that is being driven by mainly the Three Gorges Dam Corporation, and other projects that are being planned related to solar, to rail, to ports. And so overall, if for example the amount of projects committed goes through, or what has been planned goes through, Pakistan over a 10-year period will receive more annually from China in foreign direct investment than it does currently from the rest of the world. So I think, again, it's not a master plan, but it really depends on how the governments get together to coordinate which types of infrastructure, because the infrastructure gap is so large. How do you prioritize that? And that's one of the main problems of infrastructure construction building in the developing world. One is a lack of investors that are willing to go there, first of all, but also how do you prioritize different types of investment to really contribute to national growth? And given that China is just kind of starting to get its feelers out on how to best engage with other countries, especially developing countries, they're very much keen on consultations to ensure that there's domestic buy-in, and so that these projects can be viable in the longer term. And so I think in that sense, so there's different pockets of these projects that are being put in place over time, and I think that's how it's moving forward. So it's certainly not just in theory, but certainly there's lots on the drawing board that that is being considered, but this is one of the problems in identifying the projects. Overall, I think the investment related to the OBOR or the Belt and Road Initiative is in the realm of 900 billion. So that's, you can see they don't want to just, like Albert was saying, that they want to be very, very careful on how they manage the finances of that and have clear accounts so that things just don't get all bundled in together and they lose track of what's being financed and how well it's doing.
So do you have an overview of the processes, or is there an official website to get information about these corridors?
Not just of yet. I think one way to look at it is through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, the Asian AIIB is not the same as the Belt and Road. It's important to make that distinction. But at the same time, the AIIB being a multilateral development bank with a number of members has procurement contracts. All these contracts are available online. You can go there to their site to see, and whether a company can abide by what is being demanded. I think that's one way to start and to kind of build momentum and political, just joint political partnership on this level. So I think in order to get a sense of the projects, these projects are being done mainly on a bilateral level between China and the country in question. And so whether a third country could come in to also help participate, I think that is certainly possible. But that's not just going to happen without doing your homework or doing your legwork first.
My next question is, because you just mentioned the 6 corridors and it became clear that Latin America is not included in any of them. But the Chinese government say it's an open initiative. What does it mean? Is there any intention to expand the routes towards Latin America? Or how can Brazilian companies participate? For instance, can we sell machineries? Can we provide engineering services? What else?
No, certainly. I think it's open, but again, because the advancement of the project is so dependent on political relations and good political conditions, that in order to be part of that, I think it's good to, on the political and diplomatic level, to be highly engaged. And I know as Brazil is a member, as a founding member of both the BRICS Bank, or what is called the New Development Bank, based in Shanghai, and the AIIB, which is based in Beijing, I think those can be leveraged to get more information and to better coordinate that information so that companies can be involved. And obviously Brazil has a certain amount of capital goods sectors, companies that have a high relation with infrastructure building. So I think that's certainly there. But again, those relationships need to be built, especially if they're not built already. And I think that is probably the surest route on how Brazil can feel the impact. I mean, which isn't to say that there can't be a China-Brazil economic corridor at some point in time, but given the ambition or the scale of the Belt and Road as it is now, I think the Chinese wanted to be low-key to that extent and not include necessarily the whole world right off the bat. But obviously, given the demands of infrastructure in Latin America and Brazil in particular, I think that is a very important consideration for China and for them to partner up with local companies.
What's your opinion about it? Why do you think Latin America was not included?
Oh, well, why Latin America wasn't included? I think because it's not an obvious direct route to Europe. But again, if we think about China growing, as I think after the last Party Congress and the coherence in economic policy that we saw there, if it continues to grow at 6 or 7% and perhaps even more, 8%, it's going to have major commercial implications for the world. And so how is all of this commerce going to be transported in all directions? I mean, the United States, the highest volume trade isn't sort of a north-south trade, it's Europe to North America. And this is going to be China's new presence, if you want to say, in the world. They're calling it the new era, but the acceleration at 6 or 7, 8% in GDP growth means that there will need to be infrastructure everywhere. And it will certainly need to be here in Brazil. And how to get to Brazil, will Brazil go through a second Panama-like canal? And will there be way stations in South Africa for shipping coming and going? To me, it's just a symbol of what the world is going to have to do if China's commerce is going to grow at the scale that looks like China itself is going to continue to grow.
So, Chais, if I could just make one small comment. I think one thing we haven't mentioned yet is China's internationalization strategy as well, or the so-called go-out policy. And I think that's important to mention because obviously they're interested to go to Europe and to try to crack European markets, but that's not so easy. And so another alternative route is to try to open up markets that are less served. That are less developed, but also less served by Western companies. Ones that are directly related to the Belt and Road, such as neighboring Kazakhstan, aren't exactly, or Pakistan, for example, aren't exactly investment hotspots in the world. And I think China sees that and is willing to absorb that risk, but at the same time very pragmatic and careful. So I think in that sense, they want to be able to access markets all around the world, including Latin America, which doesn't preclude involvement of local companies. It's just to say that they're very keen to if Europe and American markets are somewhat blocked or having difficulties, then they will try to find ways to go around that or to make countermeasures.
Besides OBOR, China also created other institutions such as the New Development Bank and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. What is the relationship between these institutions and OBOR?
Well, I think these come out of what is a Chinese domestic tradition in financing infrastructure, which is to have government seeded, funded financial institutions that can be a catalyst for a larger flow of investment from the for-profit financial industry. And that has worked extremely well domestically. It's, as I mentioned, if you have individual projects that are individually accountable for the financing rather than giving the money to large agencies where you lose track of it, and you then include the participation of the for-profit financial sector, you get multiple eyes. You get the local government that's doing the project, you get the initial investor, you get the financial industry itself that wants to make sure that this is going to work out the way it's supposed to financially, and you also have the Planning Commission, the Chinese Planning Commission, the National Development Reform Commission, the Five Ai Way as it's known in China, itself is a powerhouse financial and fiscal agency. It's the most powerful financial and fiscal agency in China. That is having a very active role right now already, the Planning Commission, in negotiating memoranda of understanding with various countries over certain projects. It's a project-by-project system, and the financing comes from these three organizations, but behind the scenes also is China's Development Bank, which is assets worth $2 trillion. It makes these other agencies that have, AIB now has 100 billion, maybe the New Development Bank 40 billion, maybe or 30 billion, and the Silk Road Fund maybe 40 billion. Those are small amounts of money to begin with. They could grow, but the China Development Bank, with long experience in funding this kind of infrastructure, it's waiting in the wings and has promised almost $900 billion over an unspecified period of time. So these institutions are kind of an international going out or coming out party for China's domestic financial solution to doing large-scale infrastructure that has a long time frame. So in many ways, we're seeing the domestic economic methods that China has evolved going abroad, going outside.
And they are also complementing the World Bank, these other institutions.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to say about the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, or the Silk Road. There's not as much of a history there, but the head of the AIIB, Jin Chun, has worked closely with the World Bank. I worked with him when I was at the Treasury Department. We had to prepare various meetings. And he's serious about making the AIIB a world-class institution, and they're doing joint projects with the World Bank anyway. They're co-financing and co-supporting that. So as far as the AIIB is concerned, I think it will do what it's best to be a world-class public finance organization.
If I can make a quick comment. Just to be clear, I think the Silk Road Fund is the Chinese financial institute that is dedicated for the Belt and Road, whereas the AIB, with the multilateral membership, it can also contribute, but it has a different governance structure, whereas the Silk Road Fund is fully owned by different Chinese agencies, including the national development banks. The AIB, for example, can contribute to projects that are along the Belt and Road, but also outside projects. So I think it's more flexible in that sense. Jin Chun has stated that as well, that it's going to go beyond that. And the NDB, given that has a different governance structure than the AIB itself, will have perhaps a separate role, maybe more based in Africa, and hoping to link in Latin America, perhaps. But again, these things are really to be determined. One other point I would make quickly is that one way for Brazilian companies to think about or to engage with these processes is already happening with the joint China-Brazilian investment fund that has been recently created. I think that these can be leveraged to encourage stronger cooperation between China and Brazilian companies and governments, and then to use that as a way to perhaps deepen the relationship so that Brazil can also participate in these overall projects.
You were just saying that you work for the Treasury Department in the U.S., so maybe you could also comment something on President Trump's visit to China. And did they talk about WOBOR? Is the U.S. planning to join the WOBOR? Is this possible? And what are your expectations about U.S.-China bilateral relations?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think it's often easy to speculate, but right now it's really too early to say what the new administration in America is going to come away with. In terms of joining OBAR, I'm not sure you join the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a combination of individual infrastructure packages. So it may be, as it evolves, that there's an institution that the countries that are involved, that they will create some sort of clearinghouse institution where you can register and be informed and so on. Right now, that doesn't exist, to my knowledge. So that you don't really join it. The only way to join it would be to join a project, or perhaps to contact financial institutions saying, I have this much funding, I'm ready to commit as a partner in a project. What do you have? But you need to go to the financial institution. If you're really interested in the engineering side of it, you might want to talk to the Planning Commission, but you'd go to Beijing to do that. I think they're probably the clearinghouse for the projects, because they will be saying, is this going to meet the standards? So the National Development Reform Commission, both for financing at the really large macro level, is where you would go. So the United States can certainly participate in these projects. Whether it will or not, I'm not sure. With the current administration struggling a bit to define how its outward-oriented commercial program is supposed to evolve. Bilateral relations are what they're saying are important. So there isn't any reason why the United States couldn't have bilateral relations with some of the countries that are working with China, and they can try to compete perhaps or to join in, but it would have to probably engage with China in a way so that but they would be at the company level, I think. I don't think it would. Anything else in terms of U.S.-China relations? We have a current sort of momentum to rethink in the administration what our whole international trade program will look like. And there were some major promises and changes in policy that were proposed during the election campaign that really gave heart to those who felt they'd lost their jobs because of too rapid opening. But I think it's still very early to see how that will work out. We've just recently seen, I think it's today, a report about the United States arguing against giving China market economy status. When you have market economy status, you're not subject anymore to anti-dumping using prices from third countries as a measure of whether your price is fair or not. That seems to be set to go on for quite a few years. So China won't be treated by the United States as a market economy for quite some time. I think a lot of these problems were there before this administration. There are a lot of tensions of industry interests that have always come to commercial and financial agencies at the top level of the government wanting relief for this or that situation that seems to be and often is unfair. So I think that it's a work in progress, and the fact that the Chinese were able to allow U.S. financial sector companies to own more than 50% and therefore control the companies that they are part of in China is something they've wanted for over 20 years, since the 1990s. So President Trump was successful in getting that agreement from President Xi Jinping and the Chinese government. It's a fluid situation, and I think we just have to wait and see because it's still a young administration.
Okay. our President Michel Temer also visited China this year, and he presented to Chinese authorities and business leaders a package of a privatization plan for airports, highways, transmission lines, and also signed agreements that include investments in hydropower and railways. So my question to both of you is, what is the impact of OBOR on Brazil's intentions to receive Chinese investments? Should we expect they to maintain similar amounts, or will they focus more on these countries along the route and reduce investments here?
I think, in brief, I think obviously the nature of the AIB and the Belt and Road are constructed or designed as such to prioritize the near neighborhood of China and to increase connectivity there. But that does not preclude by any measure or by any means investments that could happen anywhere in Latin America or other parts of the world. And so I think as long as those opportunities are there, the political connections and ties are there, then those investments will go forward, because again they're pragmatic in that sense, and just because this is the OBOR, the Belt and Road is just one way to kind of conceptualize these Chinese thinking and foreign policy as well going forward. But that does not necessarily that doesn't mean that they'll neglect other areas that are not part of it. In fact, I think they would like to perhaps expand those areas, but again, the Belt and Road project is already quite ambitious, so I think they have a practice, the Chinese have a practice of taking things pretty gradually, one step at a time, building from the ground up. And I think that the more prepared that Latin American countries can be, in Brazil, the better that they can receive the investments and also ensure that they receive the benefits as well.
I would say that China's investment activity in Brazil doesn't need to be correlated with the One Road, One Belt at all. We'll see, I think, in the Road and Belt strategy, there will be slowdowns, there will be waiting for certain agreements to pass. It won't just be a sudden rush. And so they'll be looking for what they can implement as quickly as they can. And in that package of things that we might implement that improves our infrastructure and commercial logistical linkages to the world will be projects in Brazil. So I don't see it as crowding out investment in Brazil. China's going to go ahead with multiple channels of communication and transport and logistical linkages to the world as its economy grows and as it moves into what it sees as its new industrial capacity up to 2025, which, if again it continues to grow, will have enormous opportunities for trade in all directions. So I think for Brazil, what is Brazil's overall economic strategy? And how can it make use of what China has to offer? That's something that Brazil needs strongly to stand of itself, and I'm not a specialist on the Brazilian economy, but it seems to me that that would be where the opportunity is in Brazil's own ambitions about its economy and where China can play a helpful role as far as Brazil is concerned, not just to do sort of what China wants to do because China's growing. And that, I think that there are already reforms going ahead with different kinds of constitutional amendments in Brazil that have economic reform significance. That to me is the sort of the governor, if you will, the control over the pace of Chinese activity here. It's in Brazil itself. I don't think the One Road, One Belt initiative and its financing is
not a
as
risk.
Correlated. It's more related.
Not a risk for our projects.
I don't think so, no. In fact, it might even make the Chinese more sensitive to what kinds of projects can we do, what capacity have we expanded, and where else in the world can we take that and make it work. So it actually may enhance China's ability to offer or accept from Brazil offers for projects that are otherwise might not have been thought possible.
Good. About the projects again, you were saying about the processes and the opportunities for Brazilian companies. Maybe it's also interesting to hear about the risks, the geopolitical, geo-economic risks, also the operational risks. If a Brazilian company wants to partner with a Chinese company, for instance, invest in these corridors, Pakistan corridor, what would you say, recommend for these companies?
Well, I think certainly there's a large amount of risk in investing in some of these areas. I think Moody's has come up with a report warning that a lot of these projects may not be profitable or may not be demand for their services. And I think those must be clearly investigated, and due diligence must be done by all parties. But I think that given a strong political connection or a political relationship and joint investment in these areas, which are critical to the countries, I think certain measures can be taken to mitigate some of that risk and to ensure that the projects can go forward on a mutual beneficial basis. Yeah, I mean, obviously at the project level, there are certain risks that could happen, that could slow down production, that could lead to cost overruns. But as Albert was saying, the Chinese have developed strong capabilities in ensuring that projects finish on time and at cost, which isn't to say that they're perfect, but I think at the same time they have developed a strong track record in carrying these out. And whether that can be done across countries on a transnational basis for large projects, I think that's the nature that's the ambition that they want, that the OBOR holds. So I think that those cannot be overlooked, but at the same time, nor can the possible benefits.
It also could be there's a blend of finance, and if you're part of that blend, what have you been promised in terms of the speed of return for your money? Because these are long-term projects, and the Chinese have a record of rolling things over if they think it's still a good project, but it has just been delayed nationally. But if you're an outsider involved in that kind of work, what does your agreement say you can get out of it when? And if that's clearly understood and guaranteed, and you trust these institutions, then that you've maybe covered yourself to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to quickly recap, we already talked about the opportunities. He explained the 6 corridors, right? We have two big corridors. One belt is the economic one by land, and the maritime one. But in reality, they are not just 2, they are 6 corridors because these are breaking into parts. Could you clarify this again before I go to the questions from you?
Yeah, I think that the overland belt and the maritime road, which I guess is a bit of a confusing wordage that they use, those are the overall directions of the plan. And then the next kind of breakdown is the corridors, the 6 corridors that I mentioned. And so that's how they're being conceptualized. But the overall strands, the 2 major strands, are the belt and the road. And then under those are the corridors that make up the belt and the road.
And I would say, this isn't about going and discovering which old ancient routes were there and then let's go use those routes. This is about what are the best routes that we can figure out given our modern technology, and how do we set them up? How do we finance them? How do we build them? You see maps that show routes going to Okhotsk on the Sea of Japan, and then up to the Siberian Way, and then across that way, and others through Mongolia to the Siberian Way, and down through Burma, and not just through Pakistan, but other routes. So they're going to figure out anything that they think is going to work, and it's going to be part of the Belt Road Initiative.
Yeah. So the Belt and Road is not just about infrastructure and basic ports. They also include technology. There is a question here that just came from the audience. They want to know about clean energy. Is there anything about clean energy in these corridors?
Certainly
what is
Pakistan.
maybe environment? What is China doing to keep the international standards?
Certainly, I think the possibility of project runs the whole gamut of sectors, including clean energy, solar panels, wind energy, even electric vehicles. I think there's certainly no limit to that. Again, it's just depending on how to do the due diligence for individual projects. As I mentioned, Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor involves a solar farm as well. And so I think given that also that the Chinese have strong capabilities, having developed their own technologies and capabilities in this sector, and can do it at a very competitive level, they certainly, again, it's linked to their go-out policy as well. So it's a kind of a confluence of these areas. So they're very pragmatic, and that it's not set in stone. So if you can come to an agreement and it works out for all parties involved, then they'll do it. And so just like Albert was saying, it's not like they're setting up infrastructure so that China is the center of the world and then everything else is a spoke. I think they also increasing interconnectivity between regions, so that it's not as if it's all centered along China. So I think in that sense it's more practical and meant to foster greater ties, but also greater investment, spin out greater investment and trade.
And these regions don't have a lot of rainfall or clouds. There's a lot of sunshine, so the opportunities for solar and there's a lot of wind is something that they'll take advantage of, I would assume.
There's one question here. They saying that we often hear about Americans' opinions about China, and this person wants to know Europeans' perception about One Belt and Road. Do you know anything about European scholars or politicians?
Being a U.S. American, it's hard for me. I'm not really plugged into what Europeans think, but I think Daniel, living in Switzerland, maybe has a much closer.
You live in Switzerland.
That's right. Well, given that Europe is part of the end point of the Belt and Road, I think that they're certainly very keen to be a part of it, and so they also have certain reservations, no doubt. But at the end of the day, their companies are very keen, given that their own strong capabilities in heavy sectors, in capital goods, and in infrastructure sectors, essentially. They're also members in the AIIB, for example.
Yeah, they're almost 0.25%.
So, I mean, Switzerland, the UK was the first one to join and break the ice when it comes to non-regional members. Others quickly followed. I think it includes Sweden. I don't have the list in front of me, but you can find it online, no doubt. Switzerland joined. I mean, they all have an interest because they might be unsure, say, politically speaking, but at the same time, they see that the Chinese have shown great commitment to this. Building the Belt and Road will not be easy, but also building new development banks or new multilateral development banks is also not easy and takes a strong commitment and strong professional capacities. So I think Europe, certainly they have some concerns, especially, for example, in China's closer engagement with Eastern Europe, as we talked about in the past few days. But I think at the same time, they have no choice but to take a pragmatic role if being members, but also if they want to be strong participants.
Let me ask you, the Chinese now own more than 0.5% ownership in the port of Piraeus in Greece, and they've been investing heavily in ports in the northern Adriatic. So is there any sort of concern in Europe about the Chinese are taking over, or is there some sort of sense about the fear that they might own a lot of our infrastructure?
Well, I think that's certainly a concern. That a lot of those concerns, I think, emanate from America, perhaps, so that China's going to buy up the world. And I think that is a bit far from reality. But certainly, there's a big push to go where they're welcome, right? And then that isn't always the case. And so I think Europe will take a pragmatic stance and will most likely benefit from it, where others that are not pragmatic there's no reason for them to benefit from China's perspective because they haven't been strong contributors. And I think China definitely appreciates the contributions of European countries as well. Sorry, I missed your question about the technology and production. I think it covers, again, as I said, it covers a whole range of sectors from iron and steel to clean energy to transportation. And I think it's, whereas perhaps the ongoing, the conventional wisdom from foreign direct investment is just to allow it to come to your country and then the benefits will speak for themselves. I think perhaps countries that are looking for Chinese investments should take a more proactive approach, just as the Chinese have done in their own experience towards foreign direct investment. Of course, you can't just go out there and start making demands. You have to build your case and build your negotiating power or strength. But at the same time, I think that they are certainly wouldn't be surprised by a pragmatic approach in negotiations from local domestic
and in
host
technology.
countries.
So just the civil engineering dimension of technology, which the Chinese have had experience with building highways up to Tibet. How do you prepare a roadbed that's going to last in Central Asia? And how do you engineer highways that are safe in the kind of winters that you get there? Those are civil engineering problems that also could bring coordination in standards, particularly railroad gauges.
Yes.
And how to make sure that you don't have to take your cargo off one set of tracks and onto another train and another set of wheels because they'll fit a new way of track width. It's a long-term progress. There are now all kinds of different gauges, but if this can lead to that kind of coordination between countries, it'd be a major contribution.
Okay. Now let's talk about the NDB. We have a question here. They want to know if China is the dominant player in this institution or China, Brazil, India, and South Africa have equal powers inside this new bank?
Well, if you look at the Articles of Agreement, the governance is split equally amongst the 5 BRICS countries. So I think in that sense, it is meant to be a more equal governance structure, which is very different from the AIB. So I think it's an important way, and some of the studies we've done look at the differences between how these different institutions have been set up. Right, and so the Articles of Agreement of both institutions are similar, but also different in certain ways, and it's important to keep track of the details. For example, the AIB has provisions that allow it to boost the amount of loans it provides for the given equity that it has to 2.5%. So as Albert was saying earlier, that it has a maximum of 100 billion. So over time, it is by its legal statutory rules, it can do a maximum of 250 billion. Whereas those rules don't necessarily apply, those aren't found at the NDB as well. So I think what I'm trying to say is just that it's an experiment in how to build, they're experimenting with how best to build these new development banks, multilateral development banks, that can serve their member countries as well as other developing countries. Another important difference would be, for example, already the AIB has secured a AAA credit rating from the international credit rating agencies, which would allow it to tap bond markets globally. I believe that the NDB has yet to do so because the ownership structure is such, and the credit ratings of the individual countries are not as strong as a collective as they could be. So if those can be improved, then again, I think then perhaps NDB's role could be boosted as well. But I think that's why perhaps the AIB has stronger momentum, because essentially China is the major shareholder in that one. It has a degree of control or influence to handle the operations. Whereas the NDB, that is an experiment where the ownership is really equal, and so that'll take time for those governments to establish a consensus amongst themselves on how best to go forward. But I think they're both very important experiments that should be kept track of. I should also note that the NDB, thus far, the lending that it's done, I think 3/4 of it has been in renewable energies. So it could perhaps build a niche in this area, which is greatly demanded by not just the member countries, but many developing countries. So I think it's a very exciting time, because we're so used to the World Bank and the IMF being the rule of roost. And again, these are complementary initiatives, but at the same time, they're not. The Chinese aren't unwilling to experiment. And in the case of the NDB, it could also be experimentation. But when you're experimenting with 5 equal members, that might take more time to figure out what exactly, how to go about doing that. Yeah.
It's interesting because I attended some of your other presentations, and I also commented to Professor Albert. You also always choose the word experimentation to refer to NDB and AIIB. So is the Chinese government accepting that they are experimenting, or this is outsider impression?
No, I mean, as we've discussed in the past few days, the Chinese word experimentation, 探索, is constantly used by leading policymakers, including Chen Yuan, the former head of the CDB, the leader credited with bringing the CDB, the China Development Bank, back to life after its insolvency or its bankruptcy in the early 90s. And so this is very much part of they very much refer to their experience in domestic development finance as an exploration. And given what they've done and the recent attention that academics and scholars have looked at it, there can be no doubt that experimentation is very alive and well. Given that, if it wasn't going so well, then the CDB would no longer exist, and so because it would be running into the ground, it would no longer be functional, it would have no capital. But instead, they recapitalized it. They rejigged some of the governance structures to make it stronger. And to make it was the key contributor to China's overall industrialization. So I think it's not surprising that is being done at the multilateral level, given, of course, as well as most people know, that the governance structures of the World Bank and the IMF are stuck, in a sense, and perhaps Albert can talk a bit more about that.
Well, they also have the situation where the Chinese have a lot of experience at home in what they call pilot projects, where if you want to try a certain method or certain contractual relationship with a local government's platform company, try it out. Don't do it everywhere all at once. And if it doesn't work, then change something else. And so there'll be a lot of pilot projects, I think, all across Central Asia. And very good point. The World Bank and the IMF, particularly the World Bank, has a lot of trouble growing its capital, the scale, and then how is it used? The Chinese don't necessarily feel satisfied with their input into the way the World Bank organizes itself, and you get a lot of special funds where individual countries try to control just exactly how their money is used at the World Bank. This becomes a new show in terms of how to do international infrastructure. And the Chinese will have perhaps a different idea about various norms and things that you need to be careful about compared to the implementation of something that reduces poverty rapidly. Because they have been very successful in they've been really the reason that the United Nations has been able to reach its poverty reduction goals. And so if we're expanding that kind of thinking into very poor areas, it will be a different world than what the World Bank is now finding itself doing, which is very sophisticated, a lot of different kinds of expertise, but the huge brunt of just basic infrastructure is something the World Bank seems to be doing less of these days.
So you believe China can bring best practices?
Well, they would be best practices from the Chinese point of view, and perhaps from the developing countries' point of view in terms of how can we grow rapidly. I mean, the way to get out of poverty is not to reduce inequality. China has shown that. It's to take your economy's distribution, which starts out rather pointed and very equal, and move it very far past the poverty lines. But it gets flatter as you do that. So it's almost as if in order to defeat poverty and move fast, you need to have more inequality. That's been the Chinese pattern. And so that objective may call for less emphasis on some of the other norms that are important, but it's a question of priority. And China's priority and some of these countries in Central Asia may have different priorities too in terms of what they really want for their populations.
So I have more questions here from the audience.
Great.
This one is, I think you already replied to this, but he's asking if countries can ask to be part of One Belt, One Road.
My understanding is there's nobody to go ask. You go look at what projects seem to be planned by the Planning Commission, perhaps, or what you might think of as a good idea, or go to a financial institution and ask, what are you, the AIB or the Silk Road Fund, and say, what are you looking at to finance and can we help? So if it's the financing, if it's engineering, there should be bids that you can put in your offer for what you could do if you're a construction company or if you're a design company. So you need to sort of have your tentacles out for things that are in this whole area, but there won't be single clearinghouse for, I haven't heard of one planned,
yes.
But it makes sense that eventually there might be, just to speed all of this up. But right now, they're still feeling their way.
Sure. Or if I can add just a little bit, I mean, in May they had a Belt and Road Summit in Beijing, which was a lot of attention focused on that, with Xi Jinping also presiding over that. And I think it wouldn't be surprising if countries that are partner countries that are involved in that start not necessarily making demands, but asking, well, where can we centralize some information so that they can be shared widely. And I think that's not an unreasonable demand. Another way, I didn't have the name with me because I didn't have my notes out, but for example, the China-Brazil Fund I was talking about, the official name being China-Brazil Production Capacity Cooperation Fund, which is jointly basically between the CLI Fund, the China Latin America Industrial Cooperation Investment Fund, and BNDES, and Caixa Econômica Federal. These are also very good conduits in which to gather information, right? Given the close connection that they'll be doing, they'll be talking a lot about obviously investment in Latin America, but whether that can be extended with this tentacle, if we can call it that, is already there. So if companies and governments can leverage that, not every country has its own China bilateral fund. So I think To be really engaged, then you have to work on all channels, just like as the Chinese have done in their own experience, right?
So Brazil could be ahead of the game.
Exactly.
With this fund,
yeah.
as a communication channel.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is the last question from the audience. He wants to know the risks about Chinese investments in Brazil, in the sense that they are saying, isn't it dangerous to Brazil to be dependent on China like is happening in Africa?
Well, that's two questions.
Yeah.
First, what's happening in Africa, and then what can Brazil do? There's a bit of a controversial view about China's role in Africa. There's a view that China's coming in and doing all the work and crowding out African workers and so forth. But the academics that I know and trust that are working on this have a very different picture. That the Chinese are interested in a whole range of projects, and they make joint venture agreements about how to get it done. But the other side doesn't often deliver. And so they need to then come in and try to finish it so that the infrastructure can work. But that it isn't an exploitative process. I mean, and China's investment in Africa is quite small compared to similar investments by Europe and the United States. So the idea of China coming in unfairly into Africa is easy to say, but from my academic friends that work exactly on this area, they don't agree. So then you move to Brazil. Is Brazil at risk of being swallowed up by China? I think that is such an extreme, unlikely, knowing Brazilians that, and Brazilian policy, unlikely development. But it does mean that Brazil needs to continue to figure out what is in its interests, where is China going to fit into Brazil, rather than how does Brazil fit into China. And that seems to be a direction that's well underway, so it's encouraging, I think.
Okay, so our time is over. It was a very fruitful conversation.
Thank you
very much. I want to thank Daniel
It's
and
an honor
Albert.
to be here. Thank you.
And also thank the audience, and say that this webinar can be seen again on the web. Everybody who registered will receive the link. And thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you.